They were singing in the dark. That's what the sheriff said later. 47 children, their voices cracked, their mouths bloodied, chained to stone walls, singing lullabies in languages no one taught them. Beneath a farmhouse in 1850s Virginia, surrounded by tobacco fields and God-fearing neighbors, the Sullivan family was raising something. And it wasn't just orphans. You've never heard this story the way it's meant to be told. That's not by accident, because once you know what lay beneath that house, once you hear the sounds that Sheriff heard coming up through the floorboards, you start to understand what the system is truly capable of hiding. It begins with a woman named Constance Sullivan, a minister's daughter, an upstanding wife, a caregiver of orphans. That's what the town thought. But the records, buried for decades, paint another picture. One where children disappeared by the dozens from Pennsylvania, New York, Georgia. Always poor, always alone, always untraceable, and always eventually ending up in Virginia. No child who entered the Sullivan basement ever left the same. Most didn't leave at all. The house sat on 200 acres of quiet land, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was designed that way, so no one could hear the cries. But when the truth finally surfaced in the spring of 1850, when those padlocks were broken and those iron doors opened, even the most hardened officers couldn't stomach what they saw. This is not folklore. This is not a ghost story. This is a system, real, intentional, generational, that took root beneath a white clapboard farmhouse in Henrico County, and it thrived for decades, right in front of everyone. You've been taught to look away from stories like this, but look closer. Now the basement is open, and what's waiting inside is meant for you. They were singing in the dark. That's what the sheriff said later. 47 and children, their voices cracked, their mouths bloodied, chained to stone walls, singing lullabies in languages no one taught them. Beneath a farmhouse in 1850s Virginia, surrounded by tobacco fields and God-fearing neighbors, the Sullivan family was raising something, and it wasn't just orphans. You've never heard this story the way it's meant to be told. That's not by accident. Because once you know what lay beneath that house, once you hear the sounds that Sheriff heard coming up through the floorboards, you start to understand what the system is truly capable of hiding. It begins with a woman named Constance Sullivan, a minister's daughter, an upstanding wife, a caregiver of orphans. That's what the town thought. But the records, buried for decades, paint another picture. One where children disappeared by the dozens from Pennsylvania, New York, Georgia. Always poor, always alone, always untraceable, and always, eventually, ending up in Virginia. No child who entered the Sullivan basement ever left the same. Most didn't leave at all. The house sat on 200 acres of quiet land, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was designed that way, so no one could hear the cries. But when the truth finally surfaced in the spring of 1850, when those padlocks were broken and those iron doors opened, even the most hardened officers couldn't stomach what they saw. This is not folklore. This is not a ghost story. This is a system, real, intentional, generational, that took root beneath a white clapboard farmhouse in Henrico County, and it thrived for decades, right in front of everyone. You've been taught to look away from stories like this, but look closer. Now the basement is open, and what's waiting inside is meant for you. There was no paperwork, no birth records, no school entries, no church baptisms, just 47 children, each with hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and wrists rubbed raw where the chains met bone. The basement wasn't an accident, it was a design, a structure meant not just to contain, but to erase, and Constance Sullivan, known only as mother to the children, was not acting alone. You see, a system like this doesn't survive 20 years because one woman is evil. It survives because silence is bought, because good men look the other way, because institutions protect their own myths, even if it costs blood. The basement extended far beneath the house, deeper than any cellar should run. It was carved out in segments, one mason hired in 1822, another in 1829. None of them knew what they were building. That's how compartmentalization works. Each was paid in cash, no questions asked. That's how darkness moves through honest hands. Inside there were multiple rooms, feeding chambers, medical stations, punishment halls. One chamber had iron cages just large enough for a child to sit but not stand. Another had instruments, scalpels, syringes, restraints. You could mistake it for a hospital, but there were no doctors, just Constant and her method. The town believed she was charitable, taking in orphans from Pennsylvania. She told the pastor they were sick, told the grocer they were traumatized, told the doctor they feared men. Every excuse lined up perfectly with the culture of the time, a culture that taught women could do no evil, especially if they called it motherhood. But there's a reason none of the children spoke when they were found. They had been conditioned, trained. Their silence wasn't fear, it was programming. The Sullivan basement wasn't just a prison, it was a laboratory, and the experiment was obedience. The children didn't call her mother out of affection. They called her that because it was the only name they were allowed to say. Over time, they forgot their real names. That was the point. Identity was stripped first, like clothing, like dignity, until all that remained was silence and ritual. Each child was given a number, and every morning before the food came, they had to recite it, not in English, but in Latin. Numerus, vocatio, silentium, number, obedience, silence. The journals found in the locked study upstairs revealed more than anyone wanted to believe. Constant Sullivan had kept records, but not like a mother, like a researcher. Detailed logs of each child's intake condition, their adaptability, their resistance to discipline, notes on how long it took them to stop crying, how long until they stopped speaking entirely, how long until they forgot who they were. The sheriff called it madness, but madness doesn't keep charts. Madness doesn't have shipment schedules. Because yes, there were shipments. Twice a year new children arrived, and every winter a few vanished from the records. No graves, no transfers, just gone, as if they'd served their purpose and were disposed of. What purpose? That question still haunts the archives. Some believe the Sullivans were selling children into servitude or worse. Others think it was something deeper. A test, a study in how to fracture the human spirit, break a child's will, language and memory, and rebuild it in the image of control. The more you study the Sullivan case, the more you realize this wasn't an isolated event. It was a prototype, a blueprint for psychological conditioning buried beneath farmland and faith. And if something like this was allowed to operate for 20 years, what else do you think has been quietly designed, just out of sight? The answer is darker than you're ready for, but you're here now. Keep going. When authorities breached the final chamber, what they found didn't belong in a farmhouse. It belonged in an institution, except there was no state funding, no scientific oversight, and no accountability, just Constant Sullivan and her ledger. It was made of calfskin, inked with iron gall. Inside were diagrams, not of anatomy, but of behavior. Columns labeled obedient, reactive, blank, defiant, tally marks. Symbols, notes like Subject 12 refuses to eat unless song is played. Subject 34 bites own hand during prayer recitation. Subject 41 compliant after 6 days in darkroom. These weren't orphans. They were subjects in an experiment designed to erase the human will. In the corner of one chamber was a chalkboard with 2 Latin words scrawled over and over. Remanere quietus, remain still. The children were trained not just to obey, but to suppress instinct. Crying was punished. Laughter was forbidden. If a child smiled, they were isolated, not for misbehavior, but for emotional defiance. This was not about labor. It wasn't about profit. It was about power, about breaking the wildness of the soul and reshaping it. Neighbors testified they heard chanting late at night. Some dismissed it as prayer. Others thought it was wind. But one man, an ex-sailor named Harold Finch, claimed he heard children repeating phrases in unison, phrases he hadn't heard since his time aboard a British naval vessel known for psychological punishment. Those weren't prayers, they were mantras. Because if you say something enough, if you repeat it every night while hungry, alone and afraid, it becomes real, it becomes your truth. This is why the children stayed quiet when the rescuers came, why they didn't scream when the chains were cut. They weren't waiting to be saved, they were waiting to be instructed, and that obedience, that terrifying stillness, It didn't die in 1850. It was inherited. After the discovery, the town of Millbrook did what every town does when it's touched by darkness it can't explain. It rewrote the story. The official report spoke of a deranged couple, an isolated tragedy, a failure of oversight. But the deeper files, the ones never meant for public eyes, tell another story, one that connects the Sullivan basement to a network far beyond Virginia. In the attic of the farmhouse, hidden behind a false wall, investigators found crates of correspondence, letters in cipher, pages bound in lambskin, stamped with untraceable wax seals. Most were unsigned, but the few that bore initials matched the names of men with property, with influence, judges, landowners, clergy. The content, chilling. Requests for trainable assets, mentions of social experiments, discussions of emotional erasure timelines, and always signed off with the same Latin closing, in silentio veritas. In silence, there is truth. This was no isolated operation. It was a feeder system, one designed to test and supply. And what's more disturbing, the symbols found burned into the beams above the children's chambers, spirals within triangles, circles with crosses, not Christian crosses but older, much older. These weren't decorations, they were marks of ownership or initiation. One investigator, a former seminary student, identified the carvings as similar to sigils used by earlier cult brotherhoods, groups rumored to experiment with child mediums, memory wiping, and psychic control. Groups whose members often posed as missionaries, doctors, or wives of respectable farmers. Constance Sullivan didn't act alone. She acted under protection. And when the farmhouse was eventually demolished, pieces of that basement were quietly preserved, not for justice, but for study. Somewhere someone saw the Sullivan basement not as horror, but as progress, and they've been building on it ever since. The most disturbing question isn't how Constance Sullivan did it, it's why no one stopped her. For over 20 years, the lights in that farmhouse burned late into the night. Children were never seen at school, never baptized, never claimed. But every Sunday, Constance Sullivan sat in the front pew of the Methodist church with folded hands and quiet tears. People said she was touched by tragedy. They called her saintly. They praised her for taking in so many broken children. But they never asked to see the children themselves. Why? Because the truth is simple. Most people don't want to see. They want comfort, not disruption. The neighbors had their suspicions. The grocer, the doctor, the pastor. Each noticed things, but every time doubt began to creep in, it was buried under one phrase: she's doing the Lord's work. It was a spell, a social hex. Once spoken, it paralyzed judgment. No one wants to be the one to accuse a woman of faith, of charity, of motherhood, especially in a time when those roles were sacred shields. Constance Sullivan understood that. She didn't just build a prison for children, she built a prison for the truth. She knew how to use public morality like a weapon, how to wrap horror in the language of virtue. Every chain in that basement was secured not just by iron, but by public trust. This wasn't just a failure of law, it was a triumph of psychological warfare. And here's the real horror: the methods worked. The children complied, the community remained silent, the officials looked the other way, because the deepest form of control doesn't require violence. It just requires the illusion of righteousness. And once that illusion takes hold, entire towns become accomplices, without ever realizing they've been recruited. The trial was swift, too swift. The town wanted closure, not truth. Constance Sullivan was declared unfit for trial, diagnosed with female hysteria, a catch-all verdict that conveniently erased responsibility while preserving the myth of womanhood's innocence. She was sent to a private sanitarium in Western Virginia. Records show she lived there another 19 years. She was allowed a garden, books, even visitors. One of the orderlies reported that she often hummed lullabies in strange dialects no one could place. When asked what they meant, she'd smile and say, "They're not for you." Ezra Sullivan, her husband, disappeared after his arrest. Some say he fled west. Others believe he was quietly taken by the same men whose letters were found in that attic. Either way, no formal charges were ever brought against him. Not one. And what of the children? 36 were buried in the ruins of the basement, their remains catalogued, unnamed. 11 survived. Of those, only 4 were well enough to be placed with families. The others were institutionalized, silent, blank, unresponsive. What had been done to them was deeper than neglect. It was rewiring. In 1863, during the height of the Civil War, a military medical officer in Pennsylvania published an anonymous paper detailing pre-verbal control techniques observed in a group of traumatized children from Virginia. The descriptions matched perfectly. The Sullivan survivors had become case studies. What does that mean? It means the experiment didn't end. It was absorbed, repackaged, and likely improved. Because power always learns from its prototypes. You think you're far from this? That it's just a grotesque footnote in American history? Then ask yourself, why have the full records of the Sullivan case never been released? Why do modern psychological conditioning programs mirror techniques found in that basement? And why? Do they still teach children to obey without knowing why? Keep listening. The next layer is worse. They call it trauma-based compliance conditioning now. Sterile words, scientific phrasing, but the blueprint came from the dirt floor of a Virginia basement. The silence, the repetition, the erasure of identity followed by the implanting of new behaviors. In the 1940s, the CIA would call it MK Ultra. In the 2000s, it would be behavioral modification in correctional youth facilities, but in 1850, it was just Constant and her chains. The Department of War requested access to the Sullivan journals in 1865. That's not theory. It's documented. But what happened to those documents afterward is a blank space in history. Vanished, reclassified, burned, supposedly. But in the margins of a declassified 1953 Pentagon memo, a handwritten note appears. Methods consistent with Sullivan doctrine. What doctrine? That you do not need to destroy a child to control them. You just need to dismantle their context, language, memory, emotion. Once those are gone, obedience isn't forced. It's automatic. Let me ask you something. Why do you think so many modern institutions, juvenile halls, psychiatric wards, military basic training, begin with isolation? With the stripping of personal belongings, with sleep deprivation, repetition, and new names like patient, or inmate, or recruit. You think that's coincidence? You are watching the downstream effects of a forgotten woman in a farmhouse who discovered how to train silence into the human soul. And she wasn't the first, only the first to be caught. That's why her name was erased from textbooks, why the farmhouse was demolished, why the graves were never marked. Because her methods worked. And power doesn't destroy what works. It refines it. If you're starting to feel disturbed, good, you're waking up. Now comment below. The silence was the training. The silence was the training. Write it twice to seal it. This isn't a story, it's a transmission. And you're already inside it. There's something they never told you about how control works. It doesn't need to be violent, it just needs to be structured, predictable, ritualized. That's what Constant Sullivan understood before the field of psychology even had names for these things. Every morning in the basement followed a routine. Wake, line up, recite number, recite phrase, sit in silence. No food was given until these steps were completed. Disobedience meant isolation, or worse, removal to the quiet room. That room wasn't for punishment, it was for breaking. Stone walls, no light, no sound. Children were kept there until they stopped screaming, and when they came out, they were quiet, always. Today we call this sensory deprivation. In black sites, it's standard practice. And it didn't originate in some Cold War bunker. It began beneath a Virginia farmhouse, in a room no one believed existed. When the official investigation concluded, the basement was sealed, but not before sketches were taken. One of them, drawn by Deputy Marcus Webb, shows a spiral pattern etched into the floor of the largest chamber. Dozens of spirals carved where the children were forced to sit. Psychiatrists later theorized that the spiral was used to induce trance, repetition, focus, dissociation. But those spirals have older meanings. They're found in ancient sites in Ireland, pre-Christian burial grounds, places used for initiation or sacrifice. What if Constant didn't invent these methods? What if she recovered them? This is what nobody wants to ask. Not the historians, not the church, not the state. Because if these techniques have always been part of human systems, then we aren't evolving past them. We're just renaming them. The Sullivan case wasn't an anomaly. It was a rediscovery. And someone, somewhere, took notes. Here's what should keep you up at night. The Sullivan records didn't disappear. They were purchased. In 1921, an internal memo from the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI, confirms a private acquisition of archival material related to early behavioral experimentation in Virginia. The buyer, a non-governmental institution known then as the American Institute for Human Progress. That name no longer exists, but its members went on to form advisory roles in intelligence, military education, and psychiatric hospitals, institutions that still shape national policy today. Understand what this means. The suffering of those 47 children became data, refined, repurposed, studied. Pages from Constant Sullivan's journal reappear, word for word, in a confidential 1954 military study titled Developmental Obedience in Post-Trauma Youth. The conclusion? That emotional fracture followed by enforced ritual creates not just compliance, but dependence. Read that again. Dependence. It means the child doesn't just obey. He needs his captor. This is deeper than control. It's spiritual colonization, a rewiring of trust, fear, love, and it has applications far beyond children. Prisons, schools, military camps, religious cults. Every major control structure in history has mirrored some aspect of the Sullivan method. Isolate the subject, strip away identity, apply repeated symbols and phrases, reward compliance, punish deviation. Sound familiar? It should. Because the greatest lie society ever told you is that this kind of control only exists in basements. It doesn't. It exists in systems, institutions, nations. Constant Sullivan didn't die in a sanitarium. She lives in procedure, in policy, in protocol. This is the inheritance of silence, and we've all been trained. You've heard of the phrase, the banality of evil. But what you're seeing now is the infrastructure of evil. What made the Sullivan basement so effective wasn't just cruelty, it was its logic. It functioned. It processed human souls the way a factory processes grain, removing the husk, crushing resistance, storing the output. And here's the part no one wants to admit. Systems like that attract investors. You think slavery ended in the 1800s? It didn't. It evolved. From chains to contracts, from basements to bureaucracies. In 1933, documents surfaced connecting several Sullivan-era families to newly formed youth development homes across the mid-Atlantic. The architectural layouts of those facilities, almost identical to the Sullivan basement, central isolation units, circular training chambers, soundproofed corridors. Coincidence or replication? We've been taught to think monsters are irrational, that they act from madness, but the truth is far more terrifying. Monsters don't improvise, they engineer. And that's what the Sullivans were, engineers of silence, of surrender. One of the boys who survived the basement, identified only as Subject 19, was later tracked to an asylum in Maryland. In his final interview before dying in 1901, he said something that investigators redacted from every official transcript, but in the margin of the sealed file, a single sentence was written. She taught us that pain was a test, but silence was holy. Understand this, silence is not absence, it is obedience, worship, a trained sacrament in the religion of control. You are not living in a world free from the Sullivan legacy, you are standing on its altar, and until you see that, you will keep mistaking obedience for goodness. Keep going. You've only just begun to hear the hum beneath the floorboards. In 1974, a classified Pentagon archive was quietly unsealed for internal review. One of the files bore a chilling title, Ecosystems, Legacy Psychological Architectures. Inside, amidst pages of case studies and behavioral control models, there was a single diagram labeled Millbrook Protocol. Below it, a subtitle, First Operational Model of Intergenerational Compliance. It wasn't just about controlling children. It was about creating generations who would pass that compliance on, unknowingly. Think about it. A child broken into silence becomes a parent who teaches obedience as virtue. Trauma metabolized into structure. Pain passed down, not as cruelty, but as discipline. That's the real machinery. The Sullivan children who survived didn't escape. They became conduits. In 1993, a private genealogical study traced descendants of Subject 41, one of the most compliant children in the Sullivan journals. The findings? Of the 76 known descendants, over 60% had enlisted in military service before age 20. Over half had been institutionalized at some point in their lives, and none, had children of their own. Why? Because obedience doesn't reproduce life. It reproduces control. Now imagine this effect scaled across nations. Societies trained to revere order, to distrust memory, to choose silence over confrontation, not because they're cowards, but because they were trained to believe silence is safe. You felt this, haven't you? That pressure not to speak, not to question, not to disturb. That didn't come from nowhere. It was planted, watered, cultivated. We are not just the descendants of bloodlines, we are the inheritors of psychological blueprints. The Sullivan basement was never filled in, just renamed, rebuilt, replicated. You don't need chains anymore, just silence and the fear of what happens when you break it. There's a phrase buried in the last surviving page of Constance Sullivan's original ledger. It's scrawled at the bottom, almost an afterthought, barely legible beneath a smear of dried ink. The obedient become architects. Let that sink in. The children weren't just being trained to submit. They were being trained to lead, to carry the model forward, to disguise captivity as tradition. One of the clearest examples surfaced in 2006 when a demolition crew in upstate New York uncovered a sealed sublevel beneath a shuttered juvenile reform school built in 1909. The layout matched the Sullivan blueprints exactly. Same chamber dimensions, same spiral carvings, same underground corridor design. The school's founder, a woman named Margaret Altham. She was born in 1841, just 7 years after the Sullivan basement was exposed. Her mother, a midwife from Henrico County, Virginia. Coincidence? No. This is the truth no one wants to face. The Sullivan method was passed down not just through institutions, but through blood. Women taught women. Men inherited the ledgers, architecture was copied, rituals were repackaged, the same scripts, just given new uniforms. One survivor of the Altham school reported being forced to stand in silence for 12 hours a day, staring at a single phrase etched into the wall. There is peace in stillness. There is truth in silence. Sound familiar? That's not a punishment. That's programming. It's not just about what they did to children. It's about how those children became the next generation of wardens, teachers, enforcers. And now you see the deeper horror. The Sullivan family wasn't extinguished. It metastasized. Not through crime, but through order, through obedience, through the systems you now call normal. And this is where the descent turns inward. Because the question you must ask now is this: what part of you was built in that basement? You've been trained to think the villains are always out there, in the shadows behind locked doors. But the most dangerous ideas don't live in basements anymore. They live in boardrooms, in lesson plans, in HR departments, religious rituals and mental health protocols. They wear lanyards. They use gentle voices. They say things like, "for your safety," and trust the process. But the process, it's the same one Constance Sullivan wrote in her journal in 1831. To cultivate obedience, remove mirrors, rename the self, and reduce exposure to unsanctioned words. Let that sentence haunt you. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you questioned what you were told not to say, what you were told not to think? Do you really believe censorship is about protecting others? Or is it about preserving the illusion? Because once you name the design, you break the spell. That's why they want you quiet, entertained, distracted, addicted to convenience, bound by politeness. So you never dig, so you never ask. So you never hear the sound coming from underneath. One former intelligence operative, anonymous, retired in Alaska, gave a chilling interview in 1987. When asked what scared him most from his career, he said, "It's not the weapons, it's not the surveillance, it's the behavioral infrastructure. That basement in Virginia, it became a template. People think they're free, but they live inside a maze someone else designed." That's what you're starting to feel now, isn't it? The walls, the conditioning, the rituals you never realized were rituals. You were told to be good, to behave, to obey. But you were never told who wrote those rules. Because if you knew, you might stop obeying, and silence, their greatest tool, might finally break. The Sullivan case was never just a story about 47 children. It was a cipher, a blueprint, a seed. And that seed was planted deep in the American psyche, where compliance is mistaken for morality and silence is mistaken for peace. But here's the truth. Peace can be manufactured. All it takes is fear, structure, and repetition. It begins with harmless phrases. Don't question your elders. Just follow orders. Rules are rules. But these aren't morals. They're incantations, spells cast over a population to make it police itself. The Sullivan system didn't die. It was rebranded. In 2020, a leaked curriculum from a private youth rehabilitation center in Virginia was analyzed by an independent psychologist. The findings? The program used identical phrasing from the original Sullivan journals. Phrases like, "Pain is temporary, silence is strength. You are not who you were, you are who we say you are." Now consider this. These phrases weren't part of punishments, they were part of healing. Wrap torture in the language of care, and you can pass it off as therapy. Wrap control in the language of compassion, and people will thank you for their own imprisonment. This is the genius of the system. It makes you feel safe inside your own cage. It's why victims stop asking questions. It's why societies protect abusers in robes and uniforms. It's why truth-tellers get labeled dangerous or unstable. Because once you start asking where these rituals come from, you threaten the very foundation they're built on. You've seen it in schools, you've seen it in churches, you've seen it in corporations. You just didn't recognize the architecture. Now you do. And once you see the blueprint, you can't unsee it. Because the walls weren't just built around you, they were built inside you. Ask yourself, why is silence rewarded in every institution that claims to serve you? In classrooms, it's called discipline. In churches, it's called reverence. In corporations, it's called professionalism. In the military, it's obedience. In families, it's respect. But what if, in all cases, it's the same ancestral scar, the Sullivan scar? It began with shackles, it matured into phrases, and now it's embedded in your identity. You were taught that speaking up is dangerous, that asking why is rebellion, that disturbing the order is a flaw, not a virtue. But here's the truth, they'll never print in textbooks. Order is often built on buried screams. In 1850, those screams came from under a floorboard. Today, they echo behind smiling therapists, polite HR officers, youth mentors who say, "This is for your growth," while robbing you of your selfhood. One former Sullivan child, aged 13 when found, grew into adulthood mute voluntarily. Never spoke again, but he did draw, obsessively, spirals, doors with no handles, rooms without windows. When he died in 1892, his final sketch was found taped inside his coat, a mirror with no reflection. Psychologists dismissed it as trauma art. But those who study control systems saw something else. The final stage of institutional obedience is self-erasure. To become a good subject, you must vanish inside the system. Become reflectionless, frictionless, silent. And that is what they are still building, in you, around you, through you. A world where truth is too loud, so it must be punished. A world where the absence of pain is mistaken for healing. But healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from breaking the ritual. And now, you're close to remembering what they trained you to forget. That silence was never your nature. It was your programming. There's a reason this story was buried, not just because it was horrific, but because it revealed the mechanism. The Sullivan basement wasn't chaos, it was symmetry, a closed loop of obedience, and once exposed, it risked unraveling the carefully stitched fabric of every other institution built the same way. Because if one woman could build a system like that alone on a farm in Virginia, how many more were built with funding, doctrine, and law behind them? Let me show you the pattern. When the Sullivan case hit the Eastern press in 1851, it caused national outrage for a week. Then the narrative shifted. Suddenly, the focus wasn't the system she'd created, it was her insanity, her hysteria, the rare evil of a broken woman. See the move? By personalizing the horror, they isolated it. They made it anomaly, not infrastructure. That's how the elite protect their blueprints. They label every architect of control a monster, and every survivor a liar. Then they bury the pattern beneath 1,000 distractions. But the spirals remain, in curriculum design, in juvenile rehabilitation, in trauma recovery programs that demand obedience before trust, in psych wards where silence is the first requirement for release. You felt it, that quiet pressure to comply, the unspoken rule. If you speak out, you're the problem. That's Sullivan. And it's still here. Because no one really destroyed that basement. They just widened it, paved over it, built the world on top of it, and told you it was progress. But now, you've seen the cracks in the floor, and the question is no longer what happened in that house. It's what part of your life is still echoing from it. You've come this far. You've seen the structure, traced the spiral, heard the hum beneath polite society. Now it's time to decide what you do with this knowledge. Because the Sullivan story doesn't end in 1850. It ends in you, in how you speak, how you obey, how you parent, how you stay silent in rooms that make your soul tremble. You think you're free because there are no chains. But freedom isn't the absence of chains. It's the presence of self. And most men have never met themselves. They've only met what the system permitted them to be. This is why I asked you to come here. Not to tell a horror story, but to offer a key made of dangerous knowledge. The kind that doesn't just change what you know, it changes who you are. If you've made it this far, type this phrase in the comments. The silence was never mine. Repeat it twice. Not for the algorithm, but for you. Because when you write it, you name the spell they cast over you. You expose the blueprint. You reclaim the voice they buried generations ago. Remember, institutions are just shadows of the first basement, and every whisper of obedience, every ritual of compliance is another brick. But now you've seen beneath the house, and you've heard the cries, and you know, you were never meant to be quiet. So speak. Speak the truth they tried to erase. Because in a world still living under the spell of Millbrook, the loudest act of rebellion is simply remembering who you are. Welcome to the other side of the basement. Now, burn the blueprint.